Restoration Gone Wild. Join us for some truly inspiring stories of caring people from all walks of life working to restore and protect our natural ecosystems. Restoration Gone Wild. Fly with us to Washington State and a little gem of a community, nestled in between Bremerton and Silverdale. It borders Puget Sound and is known as Illahee. What makes this community so unique is that while surrounded by development, much of Illahee's natural beauty has been preserved. Started modestly by forward-looking residents of the past and carried on by succeeding generations. This extraordinary and sustained effort ensures that Illahee's natural treasures will be its legacy to the future of Puget Sound.
This place has been known as Illahee since the early 19th century, as the name was applied to the ferry landing here, pretty close to where we're sitting today. And Illahee is a term from the Chinook jargon, which is a trade language used by the tribes of Puget Sound, Columbia River, and the greater Pacific Northwest. That was used to trade with a lot of the early fur traders from Britain and France and other European countries. It was a language of a few hundred words, so the Illahee was one of these words that was applied to this spot, especially for the Mosquito Fleet ferry that came here. And Illahee means home and place to be. Actually, this place was known as Huckleberry Bay to the Suquamish people who've lived here for thousands of years, and referred to this in many places by these names that oftentimes would refer to resources that they may have been able to gather, such as huckleberries, and other legends and stories that were passed down from generation to generation from people and folks that had learned from their grandparents and their grandparents before that.
In 1889, the federal government set aside over 2 million acres of lands in Washington state to provide future dollars for the maintenance of public schools. Fortunately for the future residents of Illahee, 640 acres of beautiful, untouched nature was preserved in the middle of their community and became known as the Illahee School Trust Lands. The trust land was managed by the Department of Natural Resources, better known as DNR, and was enjoyed by the Illahee residents for many years. In 1916, Illahee was officially chartered as a recognized community of Kitsap County, and remarkably, many of the natural features that have made Illahee what it is today still remain because of the strong community spirit to preserve and protect these lands forever. Years later, in the 1930s, when wilderness was still in abundance, and the idea of preserving land in its natural state was not generally considered a priority, the residents of the surrounding area proposed preserving additional land. This became the Illahee State Park in 1934. Today, the park boasts 75 acres and nearly 1,800 feet of saltwater frontage on Port Orchard Bay. At the time, the establishment of the park was a milestone in land preservation efforts and would prove to have a uniting effect on the community for years to come.
There are times when I go down to our beach and I just sit down on the beach and I can just move backwards in time.
My grandfather came from Sweden and homesteaded in Paulsbo in 1886. Several years passed, and while boating south of Paulsbo, they found 10 acres of wilderness in the area now known as Illahee and bought it as a family retreat around 1911. This area was first settled with only a handful of non-native families prior to the 1900s. At that time, the area was still very remote and unspoiled. As the beginning of their adventure unfolded, they put up an old army tent and brought in an old cook stove. It was difficult to scratch out a living as a farmer in Paulsbo, so the frequent visits to the retreat were a welcome distraction. With nature as their backdrop, they relished the beach and the woods, and many friends joined them in simple pleasures like eating watermelon and digging clams. These happy memories have been the subject of family stories told down through the years. They called the land Madrona Heights in respect for the many beautiful trees in that area. Eventually, my grandparents and family moved to Seattle, and my father, his siblings, and all their children, including me, returned every summer to this enchanted place. I grew up playing and swimming on the shores of Illahee, and the beauty is etched in my memory forever. With so many wonderful childhood recollections of Madrona Heights and a dream of passing on our family legacy to our own children and grandchildren, my wife and I purchased our own land in what is now known as Illahee.
As the years passed, 280 acres of the trust lands were eventually sold off, and Illahee continued to be developed in a haphazard way. And by the 1970s, it was in danger of being swallowed up by surrounding urbanization. In 1978, DNR announced that they intended to log the remaining 360 acres of the Illahee Trust land and offer it up for development. The residents were ignited in defense of their unique community. Contentious discussions continued until 1981, when a market survey reported that approximately 1,700 housing units could be built on the trust land. DNR had no intentions of giving up this valuable source of revenue and proposed 3 scenarios. Of those, the one that created the most outrage was the option for a 25-story building and 600 apartment units and townhouses. Needless to say, local groups continued to fight this issue with no end in sight. The residents of Illahee kept up the pressure, and after endless meetings and countless letters, DNR was finally forced to withdraw its proposal. Life settled down for the Illahee residents and the years passed by. The area continued to be developed, and by 1985, the Illahee Trust land was the only large section of open space left in the area. Amazingly enough, it still retained 34 acres of old-growth trees dating back to the 1730s.
Well, shortly after we moved here, we met a neighbor, Audrey Boyer, who was considered as the matriarch of Illahee. She's an activist and concerned with all sorts of efforts to improve the Illahee neighborhood. Audrey Boyer was an arch environmentalist, recycled everything, and was truly an inspiration and made us appreciate what we have here.
Well, I think your love of nature has always been forefront.
Yeah.
As far as the community is concerned, I can remember you're forming the Illahee Community Club.
Yeah.
Putting out a newsletter
Yeah, I
for
remember
everybody to read, and you paid for that newsletter.
That's not very expensive.
You bought the postage for that newsletter.
Yeah. That's out in the back porch if
That's
you want
right.
some
Copy
copies.
after copy, month after month.
Yeah.
And then when some big event was happening in Illahee that everybody was concerned about, you would put out another newsletter. Not only did you put out the newsletter for Illahee, you developed a telephone book.
Yeah. That's just
So
addresses.
this was how you communicated with the community, so we could get everybody at those nature meetings that we would hold all the time.
I would get in news about men who had money enough and they were going to start houses built there. In other words, they would have one neighborhood after another and the trees would all be gone. And I didn't like that because I thought then we would have houses and basements and garages and cars all the way from the ferry landing clear up to, I don't know, it would cut it off. And I thought green space was necessary to keep the place livable.
But unfortunately, in 1987, for a second time, DNR became interested in developing the trust land.
Then we all learned about the prospects of the Department of Natural Resources selling the Illahee trust land. Well, there again, that was fruit for Audrey Boyer to take the lead. If she had a horse, she would have been riding on it to get the community together to do something about stopping that construction. Well, she contacted the state the legislature, the county commissioners, and everyone in the community just about was involved with trying to stop that. The Illahee trust land was going to be first logged off, and then 1,200 housing units were estimated that were going to be built on that property. The DNR folks told us in no uncertain terms at a large group meeting that we had with them that there was nothing we could do about that. The DNR's mission was to get the highest and best use out of that land, and it was a done deal. Well, the folks who were in the audience said it was not going to be a done deal. And everyone worked together from that point on to make sure that the community and the county would acquire that trust land. And they did.
As we fly over what is now known as the beautiful Illahee Preserve, we are traveling back through a history book filled with tattered pages of a strong community spirit that would not stop until its lands had been protected for future generations. The residents of Illahee fought for 23 years to secure this natural treasure.
I'm not against development, but I am against just coming in and dropping trees and clearing and forgetting about what's made Illahee, Illahee.
I was raised in New York. As kids, we lived on the streets. Streets are pavements and concrete and asphalt. Not many trees, in contrast with here. Hotter than all get out in the summertime. So hot, in fact, we as kids on the street did fry some eggs because of the extreme heat right on the pavement. That's what the lack of trees and lots of pavement and development does. In contrast to Illahee here, where it's been our efforts, along with many of our neighbors, to preserve the treed landscape.
If we lived in a place which had no trees, we would live in an empty environment. When I started the area in the Illahee Task Force in 1996, I could never have dreamed that the whole area has turned into a place for healthy living for the people in the area and for the people in Bremerton City also.
You need these places, these wild, beautiful places, in order to regenerate every spirit within you and every spirit within Mother Earth and Grandfather Sky.
How do we keep these trees and how do we keep this sweet smelling air? And the trees are our friends, that is for sure.
After this large purchase, the community continued to acquire land and conservation easements, which eventually increased the Illahee Preserve to a remarkable 444 acres. They also pushed to become a unique community, one of mostly natural spaces, parks, and low-density housing. This was accomplished by creating their own community plan, which was adopted by Kitsap County in 2008. Equally important, the community moved forward with a watershed study and stewardship program to understand how to protect what has become a decades-long preservation effort.
I think what's important in Illahee is that the individual members of the community have taken ownership of the problems facing them.
So when I became county commissioner in 2007, we have one of the most active community groups anywhere in Kitsap County in Illahee. And one of the big challenges that they put forth to me was acquiring Rolling Hills Golf Course, because when we looked at the need to preserve open space, provide recreational opportunities for growing community, and at the same time deal with some of the negative impacts of development, particularly stormwater, this seemed to be the most important, significant piece that we needed to acquire. A few weeks ago, Kitsap County closed the transaction that has allowed us to purchase Rolling Hills Golf Course, and what makes this a pretty unique transaction is the fact that the longtime owner of Rolling Hills Golf Course, Don Rasmussen, sought to donate this golf course to Kitsap County. So in a pretty rare transaction, which you really don't see very often, Don worked out an arrangement with the county so that the county would be able to acquire the golf course and not have to come out of pocket with any capital dollars to purchase a course. So in essence, the course was gifted to Kitsap County. So this is a pretty amazing legacy gift to the county, really the largest of its kind, and it allows the county to be able to ensure that we have a very important recreational amenity in our community for working class individuals for the long term. And it also allows us to add roughly 100 acres of recreational property to our Illahee Preserve Regional Park, which is just adjacent to Rolling Hills, which currently has right around 400 acres, and around the bend we have Illahee State Park. So this is really becoming a regional destination for recreational opportunities in this part of Kitsap County.
I'm very happy to find that all the things I worked for to keep from the very beginning have been kept, and more things have been added to it.
The gifting of Rolling Hills Golf Course added another 107 acres to the already acquired 444 acres. This further encouraged the Illahee community to continue on with possible future acquisitions and conservation easements. This milestone in community activism would guarantee Illahee's future would finally be in the hands of those who had worked so tirelessly to protect their beautiful and unique community.
The port identified the need to address and correct the stormwater problems that were adversely affecting the port, the Sound, Illahee Creek, and the Illahee Preserve. We were able to get the Department of Ecology Centennial Clean Water Grant, and this was to help us do a study and formulate a plan to correct the problem. Now, our aspects of concern were water quality, erosion throughout the preserve, which resulted in vast sediment coming down through the creek to the mouth of the creek, past the dock, and as far as 3 miles north to University Point. Now, there was great involvement here, not only by the port, but the community and Kitsap County to strategize and take action. This community was involved with water quality and flow monitoring. They went out and gathered experts in hydrology and geology.
I've been involved with the Illahee community for several years, and I've been very impressed with their foresight and their energy at preserving the land to protect the recharge areas, not only for the salmon and the wildlife, but for our water supply systems. It's early summer, and as you can see, we have water flowing by. I would estimate that there's several 100,000 gallons that would flow past this point each day. And if we were to come out here in a couple of months, in late August, there would still be flow coming by here, even if it hadn't rained for several weeks. It was 3,000 years ago that Aristotle and other Greeks first developed the concepts that we now call the hydrologic cycle. But one thing they couldn't understand is what we're seeing here. How do we have stream flow during periods when we haven't had any rainfall? It was in 1500s that Da Vinci first proposed that rainfall falling locally nearby contributes to stream flow and could explain how you can have flow in rivers and streams during periods when you didn't have rain. 100 years later, a Frenchman by the name of Perrault took very careful measurements of stream flow and rainfall and proved for the first time that the stream flow that we have is due to rainfall in nearby areas that recharges the groundwater system. That rainfall infiltrates into our groundwater aquifers, and a large part of that then enters into the stream through springs or directly into the base of the stream. The remaining part goes deep down into the aquifers, hundreds and maybe even 1,000 feet below the ground surface here. That supplies groundwater resources for the people here on Manette Peninsula. Fresh, clean groundwater. Of all the water on the planet, less than 3% is fresh water. And of that, only 1% is available, with the remaining 2% tied up in ice sheets. If we don't protect and restore our groundwater recharge areas, we won't have streams and we won't have salmon.
We're here on Illahee Creek in central Kitsap, and we're at the headwaters of the creek here on Rolling Hills Golf Course. Actually, the main headwaters are across the road here at the developed area on the other side of McWilliams. But if you look around, this is pretty typical of small creek watersheds throughout Puget Sound that are undergoing development. Lots of things are going on, mostly the removal of forest and wetland areas and replacing those with developed areas, roads like right next to us here, and also landscaped areas like golf courses or parks and so forth. All these areas are a lot different than the natural forest and wetlands that were here before, mostly dominated by large conifers. Those natural areas tend to soak up the water, intercept the rainfall, evapotranspirate the water up into the air, and there's not much runoff that happens at all. When you replace that with developed areas such as the golf course here, or even worse, the roads, or areas where there's housing, commercial areas, malls, so forth and so on, you get a tremendous amount of runoff. And you can see the effects of that here. This is a ravine that's basically caused by runoff coming off of the upper part of the watershed. A lot of incision going on here, a lot of basically erosion going on because of that large volume of water coming through here from the developed areas upstream that were probably originally wetlands and a mixture of forests up in there that basically, again, soaked up the water and metered it out slowly. But instead we have a lot of water coming down here really fast. During rainstorm events, it's like a torrent through here. Along with the water, of course, the sediment and the rocks and so forth get carried downstream. And while that's natural in most cases, when you have a lot of runoff, you get a lot more erosion and you get a lot more sediment deposition, a lot more sediment moving through the system, scouring of areas that could be used by fish and wildlife and so forth. So quite a different system here than we have that was here under natural conditions. And kind of hard to think about sediment other than the fine dirt or silt that you see here, but scientifically we think of sediment as any kind of particle that comes from the earth. So anything from a boulder to a cobble to a large piece of gravel big as your fist or something like that. And a golf ball is a good analogy for that sediment. It's weighted, it doesn't float, it rolls along. Maybe a piece of gravel is not quite as round as this, but very similar. And so you can see that golf balls that go in here right up at the top of the creek, because of those high flows during storm events and the runoff that causes that, those golf balls can actually get washed downstream. And I'm told that after big storms that the kids down at the bottom of the creek down there on the beach find tons of golf balls. So we're going to take a look at that, go to a couple different places, see if we can find some more golf balls. But if you think of the golf ball as kind of a surrogate for the piece of gravel or whatever in the creek, and we'd like that piece of gravel to stay in the creek and be used by fish and wildlife and so forth. But if it keeps getting washed downstream, we keep having erosion, and that just kind of, again, it's that unraveling concept that happens in these urban creeks. All right, here we are back at Illahee Creek, and here we are in the creek proper. We've come downstream about, almost a mile, midway down the creek. We're almost to the mouth of the creek, and sure enough, we were able to find a few golf balls here in the creek that floated down from the last storm event. And you can see the sediment, the actual natural sediment, gravel around here. And again, this has all been transported from the upper reaches of the creek up in the headwaters. And this piece of large woody debris, this big kind of log that I'm standing on here, you can see has captured quite a bit of sediment behind it. And that's the idea. The more of these kind of structures that are in the creek, the more complexity in the creek, the more this sediment is captured and the less of it just gets swatched through the system. So if it's captured here, it could be used by, like I said, benthic organisms that live in the gravel, also by the salmon when they're spawning and so forth. But if not, it just sluices through the creek and ends up down on the beach or out in the sound. So just like these golf balls, if you toss them in, they'll move through the system pretty quickly. You can visualize if there was a storm event, how that could be just the same thing as this gravel moving downstream.
We're at the mouth of Illahee Creek, and we just picked up in the vicinity here a number of golf balls. One of the things that's really interesting when we look at the sediment issues is that over the years, starting in 2001 when the Illahee Preserve was purchased by Kitsap County, that helped preserve 460 acres, and now the golf course is some more acreage that's been preserved. If we hadn't preserved some of that, we would probably see massive sedimentation issues on Illahee Creek.
And then the fact that the Illahee Forest Preserve has been protected is just an absolute, big plus here in this watershed, because that's what, 600 plus acres or so that is natural, native forest that's acting as a sponge, capturing rainwater, preventing runoff, and so forth and so on. And more of that needs to happen in other areas too. So the combination effects of watershed protection, things you can do on your own property like rain gardens, disconnecting your roof downspout runoff, using less impervious surfaces for driveways and patios and so forth, all contributes and all helps. Tree plantings, restoration projects, and everything that also adds to it. So a lot of work to be done, but lots of good stuff going on, and just keep it up.
When we look at Puget Sound and the issues that are facing the health of Puget Sound, whether it's for salmon habitat and salmon spawning, whether it's our orcas, we have to really understand that this is a connected food cycle, food web. And one of the real changes that has happened in the Puget Sound region over time is with natural development and with growth. We have less natural forests, we have more impervious surfaces. And what that means is that we're changing the natural ecology of our environment. Our aquifers, which we rely on for drinking water, they're not being recharged because the water that normally would recharge them is running off into streets from development and just simply going into the bay. And when it goes into the bay, it's not benign by any means. It's taking a lot of pollutants and chemicals, oil dripping from our cars, copper flaking from our brakes. And over time, with several million people living in the Puget Sound area, that has some pretty dramatic impacts. So we're really on the front lines in terms of dealing with the greater health of Puget Sound by dealing with stormwater, because that has an enormous impact on the entire ecology of the area in which we live. The thing that's interesting about Rolling Hills Golf Course is the fact that it's sandwiched between the preserve, where we have 400 acres of open space, and we have a lot of development just to the north. Illahee Creek straddles the course, and we're in one of the most densely populated parts of the county. A lot of the development that has happened historically here, the stormwater protections that we now require weren't in place when a lot of this development occurred. So really this is kind of the bright line between where we have preservation and where we have development that we all wish would have been done a little differently. What it is also, I think even more so, is an opportunity to figure out how do we try to deal with a lot of these stormwater issues that are affecting Puget Sound. You talk about retrofitting state highways and county roads and city roads and parking lots, but this in a kind of odd situation is a really amazing opportunity where we have 100 acres of land where, with a golf course, we can target stormwater improvements and try to figure out how do we do stormwater improvements so that we're absorbing this water, we're absorbing the pollutants, but we're doing so in a way so that it's aesthetically pleasing component of the golf course. What my hope has been is that we have 18 holes out here, and maybe we have a plan where, every year we're retrofitting one fairway, and we're coming up with ways that we can make improvements, over the next 10, 15, 20 years, allow it to continue as a really important recreational amenity, but also have it be an important environmental component to help deal with these stormwater issues.
One of the wonderful things that the Illahee community has done is preserve habitat upstream so that it doesn't have to be restored. Provides the shade And it keeps the water nice and cool and clean and allows the gravel to be sorted and set up for the fish to spawn in. There's insects that live in the gravel that provide food for the fish. But all the streams flowing in the Puget Sound of sizes like Illahee Creek here were once abundantly salmon bearing. And to some extent, a lot of these streams have been forgotten about by biologists because we're concentrating on the larger, what we thought were more important streams, but we are now learning that every stream flowing into the Sound is important. And the Illahee community has recognized that for some time and has been fighting to protect the habitat, to protect the water quality, to make sure we bring back salmon spawning naturally. It's really encouraging to see a wide diversity of expertise and age groups that you see in the Illahee community rolling up their sleeves, putting on their boots, getting involved, and making a difference. From the Suquamish tribe's point of view, this is a wonderful effort. We really appreciate what they've done and would like to see this effort magnified all around Puget Sound. The Illahee community is ensuring that some of these salmon in the future will be available for the tribe and for the rest of us by providing the habitat to welcome home the salmon. Thank you, Illahee Forest Preserve folks. You're really doing a great job.
It's all a part of trying to save what we have, because once it's gone, it'll never be the same. So I'm very grateful for this community, for the effort to keep the natural setting that we have as much as possible and take care of it.
It became important to me to save the trees and the natural land and the place of solid living for living things, because the future needs the healthy land to live a healthy life.
One thing that stands out in my childhood, where we would, our friends and I and our families would go to enjoy a green, verdant area, was Central Park. That's an amazing place, large, many acres, surrounded by tall buildings. We thought about the Illahee Forest Preserve. Here was something that could simulate and be a Central Park for Kitsap County.
Everything that we do is interconnected through nature,
I have noticed in bigger cities, Seattle, Tacoma, other places where parks simply get pushed out of the way by people who want to use the land to make money. This hasn't happened here. Our lives are richer because it has not happened. Our futures are better because the material which is good for a good life has been saved.
It's a story that will be told and told and told, and it goes on. But it's sure wonderful to be a part of it.
I mean, it takes time and it takes a dedicated effort. And Jim here has been working hard on not just trying to figure out the pathway and trying to accomplish and eliminate the obstacles, but also educating people along the way. And that's what's important, I think, oftentimes, is that we need to get everybody on board, because it's going to take everybody here that lives on Puget Sound and relies upon it for a lot of different things, to take ownership and understand it's not just the other guy's problem or that agency's problem or the tribe's problem or the polluter's problem or whatever. It's, we all contribute in some way, negatively, positively, or neutrally, but we need to work together in order to make this a successful effort. And you know, it starts little by little, community by community, and this is one of them that's doing it.
The port and the community and the county have demonstrated the will and the ability to move forward. And we wish to invite others to help us. There's still more to do with land acquisitions and implementing this plan to detail to make Illahee an example, not just here in Kitsap County or the state of Washington, but even our nation.
What Illahee Creek provides, in my way of thinking about watersheds around Puget Sound, is not necessarily the specific actions or techniques that need to be applied to fix the problems that are there. Many of those techniques have been well known in the region and around the world for decades, and there will always be a need to look specifically at the unique characteristics of any watershed. But what is remarkable about the restoration of Illahee Creek, and I think the lesson that can be taken forward to other watersheds, is how the actions of both individuals and, even more importantly, the collective action of a community group can actually overcome what once upon a time I'm sure looked like insurmountable obstacles, and actually take a system that people called just a ditch, hardly worth bothering about, into something that actually can be, and I think will be, an example for other groups and neighborhoods and maybe even whole communities to do to their own watersheds. It really makes for a much better place to live, and I think in the end that's what we're all after.
Illahee continues to preserve its natural features by acquiring an additional 21 acres for the Illahee Preserve, to protect its aquifers by implementing projects to maintain a water balance, to manage its watersheds by promoting rain gardens and low-impact development, to minimize stormwater surges with stormwater retrofits, all of which make for healthier salmon runs.
Saving Puget Sound, one watershed at a time for future generations.
Forevermore. It is said.
I can remember sitting down and right in front of a big huckleberry bush. And I'm eating a huckleberry and another one and another one and another one. And I'm in the woods. There's nothing around me that doesn't tell me that this is all woods. And all of a sudden, I get a bite on my leg. And I think, whoa, what was that? And then nothing. And then about a minute later, I get another one, and then I get a couple more, and I jump up, and I figure, I better take my pants off. Well, I'm a young kid, and there's nobody there, so I drop my pants, and I've got ants in my pants. Not bats in my belfry, ants in my pants. Well, I haul down the road, down the trail, over, and get running up, and my mother and my aunts are playing pinochle out on the porch. And I come running up and say, Mom, I've got ants in my pants. And she says, well, go down into the basement over there and take your pants off and shake them out. They'll leave. And I thought, why didn't I think of that? Why am I running all the way from way up on the hill to come down? But anyway, as I'm walking over to the basement, I can hear them all laughing, and then they keep on slapping cards down on the table and playing pinochle. But my whole point here really is that I lived that way. I lived in the nature. And what I could see nature was doing for me, it was giving me food. It was providing for me. It was making it so that if I was out in the woods, I could live from the woods as long as I took care of the woods. And Jim and the preserve and the town of Illahee and the people around Illahee all seem to understand that.